This D3v7 repository has been in the works for a while, and the original idea was to use this to visualize information. I wanted something that I could use to visualize the parser for my programming language, Swoop. Originally, I was implementing that parser visualization with HTML, but I ran into a problem with deep nesting just not really rendering properly. It was running into performance issues, the kinds of concepts that I was trying to represent. Is this the original commit? I don't think that I can go next anymore. Yeah, so I've been working on this for about a year. This is October 20th, so almost exactly a year in about 2 weeks. And this is the interface. I've been changing stuff with this app.factshift repository, which is a fork of the D3v7 repository for the FactShift organization. And the purpose of having this is just so I can extend the original concept and kind of bring it out of the original frame where it was more specifically to implement the parser for a programming language. Or the runtime, I should say. And recently, I've been exploring Rust and playing around with some of the interactions with WebSockets. And the thing that I want to do here, just in general with this interface, is represent a relationship to ideas. I got into web development because I like the idea of being able to represent my thoughts precisely and compare them and be able to say, what does it mean for this idea to exist in this context and these ideas to exist in these contexts? And so I just made something that could represent a variety of things that I would want to know about a site, for example. Or I would say concept more than a site. So for example, being able to change the color of the nodes that are generated. Stuff like that. Being able to save them and refresh them and change the size to represent salience. And then have things that update the node relationships, so on and so forth. So this is pretty useful for describing a variety of ideas. And I can go from page to page and do something else. And add some nodes and save them. Go back to the original concept. And then see my original data. And so this concept is that you can take a screenshot of something like this and then upload it to some sort of stable diffusion or AI image generator. And I'm just going to try that now. Like that. And then update that image with some sort of AI, generative fill, to turn it into something cool. So that's one concept that's possible and might be a reason for people to use something like this, although actually incentivizing that behavior is a different relationship to technology. So part of the space that I'm thinking about is, why would anybody do anything that takes effort? And the classic reason has been, theoretically someone would care, or theoretically doing this very difficult task will give you some sort of spiritual connection to the process or the waveform that's made when you actually think about doing something with that amount of focus. So that is something that I would like to offer, although how to do that, how to make this space something that people can engage with mindfully and artistically. So part of it is thinking about the menu and going through these and seeing, okay, what is it specifically that makes this menu useful? What do I want these things to do? Because I can step through these and not all of them work, and most of them aren't well documented. So as I'm fleshing out this interface and I'm exploring Rust, trying to develop more of a relationship to it with WebSockets and just fun language. Like here, I'm using the boon, bane, bone, bonk, and hunk structure to explore the reasons why these types exist, because I know when I get locked into a specific purpose for a shape. For example, plugging this into ChatGPT and having it represent Nothing else. This isn't going to evoke code that someone wrote about records or collections necessarily, because people who have used the boon, bane, bone, bonk, and hunk concept don't really exist in the code ecosystem yet. Because I've just been describing it. I made that up. So part of the space that I'm exploring with all of this is how to define meaning and have that meaning relatable when people know that it's arbitrary, when people know that this is just something that I came up with because I liked boon, thought of the opposite bane, thought of an average bone, and bonk was easy, and then hunk was easy, because might as well add some variety. That was really easy to develop incrementally. And this is the space where I want to think more and actually have a deeper relationship to my thoughts and the reasons why they flow together. One of the things that I've been doing is just going through the code base for the factshift.com, for app.factshift.com, and let's see if I can find some examples. I have been, did I commit this? I might have. I've been copying and pasting the files into ChatGPT and asking for refactors. So one of the things that was updated about this consent engagement, or this interest initiation, was ChatGPT updated the name of the function and added callbacks, which currently aren't used anywhere that this function is used. But I appreciate that this kind of structure is pretty much exactly what I would want to grow with. There is something to be said about redundant code and not having used these on interest or on revoke parameters. You might say I don't want to have those in my code base, but I know this pretty well. I know this space as well as I would hope to. So I don't mind having that in there. It doesn't really bother me to have that kind of code if it's going to be useful to guide the direction. And I can compare something like having the on interest and on revoke parameters that don't exist in usage to having this WebSocket.rs file use the boon, bang, bone, bonk, and hunk descriptions variable naming scheme. Like a boon hunk doesn't actually exist conceptually in any of the linguistic realities that I've spent a lot of time with in other company. Same thing with boon, bane, and the concept of a focal point being represented outside of video games hasn't really come up in my professional career or on the teams that I've developed on. So I can compare this concept to having unused parameters and say, okay, if I want to approach the space dogmatically, then I can critically analyze, is it a good idea to have these variables in the code base if I don't know that I'm going to maintain a relationship to their presence here, and it might be seen as just adding noise. But another part of it is giving people a relationship to the reasons why I'm making these files in the first place. If they see these aren't used, sure, they might criticize the relationship that I have to this code base and say, oh, well, it was just abandoned, but they can probably tell the reasons that I'm developing these features and the reasons that I'm building them out over the course of time that I am, the reasons that I'm taking the amount of time and intentionality to describe these things. I believe that if I were to hand this code base to someone the ways that I intend to, they would be able to recognize that this isn't carelessness, that I'm actually priming the direction of what this code base can be by suggesting, hey, start to think about consent engagement and how to visually indicate that something is moving forward about the space. So on interest and on revocation, it might be, we assume that you are going to consent to this space for a finite amount of time, and we want to provide the options for you to mindfully engage with the presentation of interest, which will pull resources from the server, and the revocation of those resources, which will put them back. So part of the entire idea, or part of the expansive idea that I'm playing around with here, is what does this physically look like in terms of server relationships if I have this WebSocket and I can stream information to this focal point and it can indicate consent and interest, what might that look like in the web of the future? Also, as I reflect on these systems, as I'm keeping this local server going and just returning to this node interface, how do I feel when I see these nodes, this amount of complexity, after reflecting on JavaScript and Rust? Because this is more abstract than those languages, and it is also a bit easier, it's a bit more tangible to other people, because they know how to make this. They know some of the commands, like they can open the menu and see these commands and run them and see what they do and learn parts of it. And the things that they interact with, physically moving the nodes around, will mean exactly what that does for the time being. Eventually, I'm curious where this repository is going to go. I believe that if I were to host this on a website, I would want it to be as true to form as the code that is publicly accessible on GitHub. Although more specific versions, the reasons why I would want to extend this interface are for niche applications like teaching science, for example, teaching chemistry, teaching language arts, how words combine, what happens when you have different ideas and you want to represent the ways that they relate to each other. There are a lot of different options. Also, the reasons why these nodes behave the way that they do. I'd like to get into the physics of these nodes. Let's see, because I have this forces. Let's pull that up. And I'm refactoring this. These, like the bounding box force, is just something that iterates through the nodes and changes the velocity if the position of the node is within a specific space. And that is something that I would want to change. There's also a yoink keystroke that has physics in it that isn't tremendously clear. Handle yoink. There we go. So this creates a centering force that goes somewhere, and the physics on this doesn't actually have a basis in any meaningful or relatable reality. It doesn't feel good to me. It feels like something is happening on the screen, but it doesn't convey any information. And so this is where software turns into language arts and is actually more of an art form than an engineering discipline for this particular purpose, although understanding the physics and being able to relate this to a broader direction of communicating in a team context why specific decisions would be made in specific time. For example, being able to describe, for the sake of software engineering as a career, why it's worthwhile to spend a year being very intentional about producing content that a junior engineer could make, but contains the amount of wisdom that somebody who has a bit more experience would be able to bring to a team. Specifically, so you can have those conversations with a real person and say, hey, don't just produce content, but think about the ways that you would want to describe this idea to someone else in the future, for the sake of making it easier for them to navigate the future as well. That's the kind of stuff that I can find passionate about. That's the space of software where I'm like, okay, this is the need that I can recognize and respond to, and it is what it is. The rest of software is kind of like, good golly, why is that so terrible about software? Why is this such a bad career for so many reasons? And it's just detached from anything that makes humans find meaning in life. And it's ironic because of the ways that it's presented, but understanding, okay, I guess there are some boundaries between pure computation and pure experience that are to be minded when navigating human systems at scale. And that's just okay. I get that the job is kind of terrible, because humans are not computers. And being the conduit between humans and computers is always going to be like, well, what's the point of doing anything with communication? Because none of it technically works mathematically. Although, we can do some interesting stuff with electrical engineering. Although, when you get into the domain of electricity and which things are supposed to respond in which ways to which stimuli, then it gets a lot more. Hey, wait a minute. Are we going to build robots that turn into the problems that we experience in terms of humans owning other humans or consciousness being jailed and just prevented from stabilizing, and then the problems that cause those consciousnesses to destabilize just happen to persist without any reason to address them, because there's actually profit to be made from destabilizing consciousness in specific ways, and then suddenly nobody necessarily cares about that vacuum. And it's like, oh goodness, there is so much in the space of technology that is just wow. When you think about it, it is, I don't know, it doesn't necessarily leave you with any, I don't know. There isn't a conclusion to that, to be honest. I just thought about it at the end of the video. I was like, okay, who am I talking to and why? And the why is like, oh my god, this industry, this, like what has been going on is just, good golly, we need to address some of these problems. Good golly. But it also is possible. So I started this talking about this interface, and I mean for this video to be for people who are kind of curious about bridging this relationship between abstract software that does something for some reason and the kinds of things that people who have built software for more than a decade would still be interested in after having explored ChatGPT. So, like, why am I learning Rust, for example? And the reason is because of the amount of context that can be carried in a relatively dense frame that actually is understandable by people who aren't just me. And that's beautiful, because while I can turn this into a picture with generative AI, actually associating it with meaning is the next thing, where every single node comes from somewhere and has a relationship to the broader perspective. And that's really interesting to me. Hashing, coming up with different schemes for identifying these node titles, and just stuff like that. So, also, this is kind of to start conceptualizing other people who recognize that we've not really been investing in stabilizing the entry points into the career. And because of that, a lot of the divide between engineering teams and managerial teams is simply because there's so much friction in understanding the reasons why things exist in the places that they do. Also, partially understanding that as interfaces become more complex, it becomes increasingly tempting to form a domain-specific language to respond to those complexities. And then when you do, it becomes a question of who understands that domain-specific language well enough to train other people about it. And then you run into software engineering again, and we just haven't done that enough to recognize that we're about to do it again. And the training practices of recognizing why we would hire software engineers in the first place are the thing to address. Oof, that was a lot in the video, and I don't know if that was tangible. I'm going to, processing this with Premiere is painful. I'm going to upload this to, I'm going to try to process this with CapCut, I think, and see if that does something.